Over the years, the beautiful Hudson River has been made sick. She needs to be cured. Early Manhattanites enjoyed the river alive with shad, sturgeon, striped bass, and oysters the size of dinner plates. Here's Henry Hudson's Half Moon. The Half Moon was 85 feet long and it had a crew of 16. Here's a postcard, probably from 1909, showing Henry Hudson making friends with the Indians. Looking good, Henry. The trend is set here for future New York real estate deals, as the Dutch buy Manhattan for $24 in beads and also trinkets. Many of us might not be thinking of the Hudson at all were it not for the legendary folk singer Pete Seeger. Pete inspired others. The Hudson River is long, rocky, with strange gusts of wind and currents that'll throw a sailboat off course. And if you're only trying to get across it, it was difficult. Steamboats would be helpful. Robert Fulton's steamboat, the Claremont, made the New York to Albany trip in 1807. It burned wood chips that sent sparks onto the rear deck. Robert Livingston was the entrepreneur who backed the Claremont. New York State had granted Fulton and Livingston a monopoly on steam traffic on the Hudson, but in 1824 the Supreme Court, led by Justice John Marshall, ended it. The following year, a steamer named the Chief Justice Marshall would come on the river. It was the first boat with a reading room and a barber shop. The fastest steamers were made in the 1860s. They were about 300 feet long and 35 to 40 feet in beam. The Chauncey Vibber was fastest at 30 miles an hour. Mary Powell did 25 miles an hour. They had murals and paintings and beautiful interiors, and this class of boat had room for about 1,200 passengers. They burned coal. The coal was loaded in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Children from orphanages in Philadelphia and New York City were sometimes lent out in summer to work on the canal.
In 1825, the canal was started. It was the idea of Maurice and William Wirtz out of Pennsylvania. They were two dry goods salesmen, and they were owed money by the government after the War of 1812. They came up with a plan that would look like what had just been completed in upstate New York, and that was the Erie Canal. They hired the members of the survey crew from the Erie Canal, brought them down here to do a study to see if it would be feasible. Proved that it would be feasible, and at a cost of about $1.2 million to make a canal 108 miles long from Honesdale, Pennsylvania to Eddyville, New York. The Delaware was too wide and too fast and too shallow to haul boats down. This was all accomplished by 1828.
Steamer M. Martin loading on coal.
120-ton boats. They're 90-foot boats.
90-foot boats,
right.
And they would hold 120
ton.
Okay. And 3 men can unload by hand 25 tons in 8 hours. Coal shovels. The town of Eddyville. Barges waiting to be unloaded. Schooners waiting to be loaded with coal. Bluestone waiting to be loaded. Quarried locally around Saugerties. Saugerties bluestone sidewalks. Bluestone was quarried right here in the High Woods area near Saugerties.
Barges full of lumber were sent down.
Around the towns of Rosendale, High Falls, Kingston, and Saugerties, limestone was mined for natural cement. The limestone would be turned into cement in kilns like these. Where the river widens at Haverstraw Bay, vast clay deposits gave rise to a thriving brick business. On the east side, bricks were made for Plank Point. Downstream on the west side, the town of Haverstraw was a center for brickmaking. Most of the building materials for the New York City area were taken down the river on barges. There was cement, bricks, lumber, bluestone, in addition to coal. One of the early residents of Tarrytown, New York, was Washington Irving. He liked it there a lot until 1849, when the railroad came through his front yard. Hudson River Day Line CEO William Elmendorf in 1903. The Day Line was well loved. It would pick you up at 8 a.m. in New York City and get you to Albany for a 6:30 p.m. dinner. Here's a Dutch-style building that the Day Line thought in 1905 that they would want to build. William Elmendorf must have thought very highly of Washington Irving. In 1912, he launched the Day Line's biggest vessel, the 6,000-passenger Washington Irving. The following year, he opened new offices in Albany that strongly resembled Irving's home, Sunnyside. Here's Charles Van Santvoord, the CEO of the People's Line. The People's Line had facilities in Jersey City, and it ran from New York City to Saratoga, north of Albany. There had been horse racing at Saratoga since the 1860s, and at Albany as well. But there were other competitors. The St. John from the People's Line. The Benjamin Odell from the Central Hudson Steamship Company. Here's the Benjamin Odell backing out of the ice in Castleton, New York. In 1923, Elmendorf responded to the competition by buying 320 acres of farmland and former brickyards just south of Peekskill to open a European-style pleasure park. It had a beach and a huge swimming pool, a dance hall, walking trails, a lake for rowboats, and a farm where produce was grown for the Day Line's various restaurants. And of course it had 2 piers for Hudson River Dayliners to dock. He named it Indian Point Park. But that didn't deter the competition. And now the competition was coming both day and night. September 13, 1948, the last southbound run from Albany to New York was made by the Robert Fulton. The Day Line sold the boats, the company name, and the parkland. The land was resold and sold again. Consolidated Edison bought part of it for a nuclear plant. They call it Indian Point. In the upper left is an empty swimming pool, and along the river's edge is still a beach. The nuclear power plant is coming on. Hudson River Dayline's office building is now a restaurant, but no weather vane.
I'm Tina Posterly, press officer at Riverkeeper. Riverkeeper has been in existence for over 46 years, and it began as the Hudson River Fishermen's Association and has evolved into an organization with a constant control boat presence, a water quality testing program. There are spent fuel pools at Indian Point, and they have been leaking into the ground and causing damage. There's also radioactive leaks that occur at Indian Point. But the spent fuel issue is being addressed somewhat now through a waste confidence ruling that the DC Circuit Court had upheld in 2012, where the NRC has to come back, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has to come back and present an environmental impact statement for all nuclear plants across the country.
In a dimly lit hotel ballroom in Tarrytown, New York, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would offer a hearing into its 500-page environmental impact statement.
It's my pleasure to serve as your facilitator tonight, and I'm going to be assisted by Miriam Juckett right here. And Miriam is from the Center for Nuclear Waste Regulatory Analyses in San Antonio, Texas. I'm going to ask you to be brief in your comments.
I offer these comments tonight on behalf of Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, who thanks the NRC. As you may know, Attorney General Schneiderman led the coalition of states that brought the successful challenge last year to the temporary storage rule in the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. This successful challenge resulted in the NRC embarking on the draft EIS currently under evaluation. The draft EIS recognizes that spent fuel pools are susceptible to fires and that a fire would have severe consequences comparable to those of a severe nuclear reactor accident. However, the draft EIS is critically flawed because it attempts to analyze those consequences generically for all nuclear facilities based on the modeled consequences of severe accidents at 2 nuclear power plants located in rural or less populated areas. Accident consequence factors specific to Indian Point, such as surrounding population, building density, critical infrastructure, and proximity to significant surface drinking water supplies, have not been taken into consideration in assessing the consequences of a fire or other spent fuel pool accident. Thank you.
I work on earthquakes, both worldwide, and also we're going to be talking today about earthquakes in our general vicinity of the lower Hudson River, New York City, Philadelphia, etc. Many people don't think that we even have earthquakes. And this region is not as active as California, Alaska, or Japan. But nevertheless, we do have earthquakes, and they present a risk to critical facilities like nuclear power plants, and in our area, particularly Indian Point.
Particularly since 9/11, we've been working closely to prevent the relicensing of Indian Point and to deal with the nuclear waste issue. Concern with Indian Point and with the nuclear waste stored at Indian Point, we have currently over 2,000 metric tons of highly toxic, highly radioactive waste at the site. Our main concern is that the waste stored in the pools is vulnerable to terrorism, it's vulnerable to accidents, it's leaked into the Hudson River, and so the overarching need, both immediately and in the long term, is to move the waste out of the spent fuel pools and into dry casks. How do we allow licensing of nuclear reactors and the relicensing of reactors like Indian Point to continue while this waste piles up with no solution in sight? The most obvious alternative to that, and they have to look at a whole range of alternatives, is to stop producing waste. As Ms. Dean said, all the waste will be out of the spent fuel pools 60 years after the plant is permanently shut down. I can tell you I've never heard Entergy commit to removing all the waste from the pools, and there's no sign that they will do so in those 60 years. And there's also regulation with the NRC that would allow them to ask for an exemption from this requirement.
I was here about 2 years ago, and at the time my mind was blown by the presentation from the NRC that they had issued that year 1,100 exemptions from safety procedures.
So we will look at over here our compilation of historic earthquakes. So we can see here is New York City, Philadelphia down here, and the pink are the older rocks of what is called the Reading Prong, and over here the Manhattan Prong. In between is a basin called the Newark Basin, and we'll find that there are relatively few earthquakes there, and most of the earthquakes are in these older terrains and their extension beneath the coastal plain of New Jersey.
I'm Ellen Ginsberg, and I serve as Vice President and General Counsel of the Nuclear Energy Institute. NEI's members include all operating reactor licensees. The context of the initial lawsuit in 1979, which challenged the NRC's failure to consider the environmental impacts associated with continued storage, the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia stated succinctly, where factual issues do not involve particularized situations, an agency may proceed by comprehensive resolution of the issues rather than relitigating the question in each proceeding in which it is raised. In 1983, the Supreme Court endorsed the NRC's long-standing approach. Its commentary was as follows: the generic method chosen by the agency is clearly an appropriate method of conducting the, quote, hard look, close quote, required by NEPA.
Of the Radiation Public Health Project. And as we all know, this fuel at Indian Point is piling up, and currently there's approximately 2,400 tons of radioactive waste. If it's relicensed, there'll be an additional 1,200 tons. One thing that has not been discussed and is not discussed in the GIS is how much high burn-up waste there is. And high burn-up waste is a really serious question, and the NRC will not answer how much there is, because that waste takes longer to cool and has to be handled differently. When we know that after 60 years of nuclear fission, we don't know how to handle the waste is ridiculous. And this idea that there's a possibility, there's magical thinking, that there's going to be in 60 years we're going to figure it out, makes absolutely no sense. And that's what this GIS there are three basic assumptions which this document is based upon, which are false and misleading and inaccurate, and therefore the GIS is fatally flawed. The first one is that when necessary, there will be a permanent waste disposal. That is absolutely impossible. That the leaks at Indian Point were only found by accident. They were only found because an independent contractor saw wet on the ground. There is no actual monitoring of the spent fuel pools. In fact, there's no actual monitoring of the releases of radiation. Is the spent fuel pool 2, which is known to be leaking, only 40% of it has been inspected. 60% of it, which we know is leaking, they don't know where the leak is. It's not been inspected. That's a false assumption of this GEIS. The other basic false assumption is that the leaks are emptied into a drain that can be monitored, and then they'll be treated and cleaned up. When in fact, the NRC stopped cleanup of this Indian Point site. They said, you know what, we're just going to let it seep into the ground.
So our largest earthquake is in 1884. It's fairly well located just to the south of Coney Island and Brooklyn. It's about magnitude 5.25 on the magnitude scale. And it's been a controlling earthquake for making estimates of future hazards and risk.
I'm a staff organizer with Alliance for a Green Economy. We're a statewide coalition of environmental and social justice organizations. And we're concerned about the waste building up at Indian Point, as well as New York's 4 other nuclear reactors, which are all on the shore of Lake Ontario: Fitzpatrick, Ginna, 9 Mile Point 1, and 9 Mile Point 2. I was born in 1979, and that's the year that NRC started writing the first version of its waste confidence rule. So for my entire lifetime, this rule has been used by the NRC to dodge hard questions about the legacy of the dangerous radioactive waste building up at our reactors.
Let me assure you that when the government policy is set to benefit corporate interests, we, the public, lose every single time.
Just very briefly, I've been looking at pictures of birth defects from the kids that are being born now in Iraq from the depleted uranium that their parents are being exposed to all the time. And it's radiation poisoning, and what it does is it's heinous. You know, I can't describe the photograph.
Our largest earthquake in this 35-year period is called the Dobbs Ferry earthquake, which is just across the river in Westchester from where we are now.
The DGIS analyzed quote-unquote reasonably foreseeable events and did not consider worst-case scenarios.
If there was a major accident here, no matter which way the winds are blowing, it will be over land. So any radioactivity, radioactive particles would be deposited downwind.
I think it's time to look at the worst-case scenarios given what has been taking place in Fukushima, elsewhere, climate change, floods, potential seismic issues, and so forth. Thank you very much.
Another feature that we could see for the first time, and we described in our 2008 paper, was this distinct boundary, okay, between no activity up here and a lot of activity down here that we called the Peekskill-Stanford seismic boundary. And so this comes up to near Peekskill, and Indian Point nuclear power plants are situated right about here. So this boundary, as well as the earthquakes along the Ramapo seismic zone, come very close to Indian Point, within a mile or two.
The Stanford Peekskill boundary runs approximately northwest through Westchester County to Peekskill.
I currently make my living providing consulting in the area of spent nuclear fuel management. I've read the revised waste confidence rule and associated environmental impact statement, and I commend the NRC staff on doing such a thorough and thoughtful job. These power plants do not require the sun to shine or the wind to blow to keep the electricity flowing. They are there 24/7.
Indian Point is anything but generic. It is a specific power plant in the most crowded region of the United States with 20 million people living in a 50-mile radius. So I think to apply a generic EIS is ludicrous. As I understand it, the NRC is charged with the oversight, not the defense of the nuclear industry. And with all due respect, the GEIS seems to be a huge attempt at legitimizing the continued production of irradiated waste for which we have no true solution. As a homeowner with an old and troubled toilet, I would cease to use it if it became so filled with waste that I could no longer flush it. I would not continue to sit there and eliminate any more waste into it. And the thought of leaving little empty boxes that may degrade around my house is absurd. You might say, that's crap.
Oh, we are a gaggle of grannies, urging you off of your fannies. Indian Point is a dangerous joint. Shut it down.
I live 5.5 miles from Indian Point. I was going to start off talking about what a poor job I've observed the NRC doing in terms of preemption of problems. They didn't prevent Con Ed from having a steam pipe eruption that released radioactive steam into the atmosphere and irradiated water right into the Hudson. They couldn't prevent more ruptures and leaks in underground piping. They had no idea that their spent fuel pools were leaking until, as somebody else mentioned, a contractor started doing excavation and said, oh, it's wet outside the spent fuel pool. They're obviously much more interested in the financials of the operator. That came out in an Inspector General's report when they almost let Davis-Besse reactor outside of Toledo, Ohio, have a breach of containment because they were concerned about the financial impact of shutting the plant down to find out what the problem was. In terms of Indian Point, we have an intersection of two seismic faults. We have two large high-pressure natural gas lines between the faults and the plants. During Superstorm Sandy, the plant came close to flood level from the Hudson River surge. It would seem to me that these characteristics might not be universal, so why would there be a generic EIS?
We are concerned about faults of about this orientation, and up here that there is another one to the northwest of Indian Point that forms a very prominent valley, and the Hudson River takes a major zig at that point.
Here's the zig that the river takes in close-up, and just south of there, the black dot is Indian Point.
Poisons the Hudson River and groundwater. Indian Point is situated on two fault lines. Scientists at Columbia University reported that a 7.0 magnitude earthquake is possible at Indian Point. And this aging structure was built to withstand a 6.1 earthquake only.
Indian Point and other reactors in the east are not designed for very large earthquakes. The consultants to Indian Point claimed that Indian Point was in the Conestoga Valley tectonic province or geologic province. So what they did was to gerrymander the earthquakes so that you didn't have to consider strong shaking at Indian Point.
The radioactive material being stored at Indian Point is the equivalent of over 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. Cancer rates are 66% above the average in communities surrounding Indian Point.
My name is Paul Steidler. I'm with the New York Affordable Reliable Electricity Alliance. First of all, it's important, I think, that we all recognize that nuclear energy is safe. In the 50-year history of commercial operation, there has not been a single death from nuclear energy.
I didn't even get to the GEIS. I didn't get to anything. All I got to was waste confidence. Whose confidence are we talking about? Are we talking about your confidence? Because you're not talking about our confidence. Where does this confidence come from that you think you can handle nuclear radioactive waste for 240,000 years? There is so much arrogance going on at the NRC and has been for decades that you think that you can con us into thinking that there is any solution for that. There is lip service, only lip service paid to the public health and safety. We all know that you are beholden to the nuclear industry. And we want you to know that we don't believe you anymore.
Anyone can report a violation, but the Department of Environmental Conservation has staff dedicated toward that, and unfortunately, over the past several years plus, that staff has been dwindling.
I started commercially fishing when I was 10 years old. It's about 1965. My father and my brother and I, in fact our entire family, had a business on the banks of the Hudson in Piermont for about 40 years. So yeah, 1973, 74 is when we first learned of it. And we were sort of powerless to do anything about it. This was an edict that came down from the Department of Environmental Conservation, and we learned a lot at that time, all about PCB, polychlorinated biphenyls, a lot more than I ever wanted to learn about PCBs. This is a DEC biologist, Kathy and her crew out on the Piermont Pier taking samples, beach seining and taking samples of striped bass, and they're weighing them and measuring the size. They do that every year at various locations up and down the Hudson. When the DEC came down and said we're banning striped bass, it was very difficult for us to understand and to take this, because it's like going to Iowa and telling a corn farmer that you can't grow corn anymore. So we had to pick the striped bass out of the net and throw them overboard. Our organization, including a bunch of Long Island commercial fishermen, we sued General Electric. It took many years, I think about 9 years, and we were successful and we won a monetary judgment from GE, but commercial fishermen in the Hudson only received a $5,000 payment. And Long Island commercial fishermen received a $25,000 payment. There was a documentary with the GE chairman, Jack Welch, where it was done on 60 Minutes, where he says, we had a permit, and he is correct to some extent that he had a permit to dump PCBs in the river from the DEC. But that permit ultimately was rescinded and they continued to dump PCBs.
There was a report that came out in January of 2013 that did show that the whole length of the Hudson was impacted by the PCBs, not just the dredging area that they're doing right now. It's 136 acres of hot spot, so to speak, which is outside of where they're currently dredging, that we want to have that addressed as well.
8 miles separate Hudson from Coxsackie, and 4 Mile Point is halfway.
We began in 1963 when a handful of citizens decided that a proposal to build a huge power plant into the side of Storm King Mountain, one of the historic and scenic cultural landmarks of the whole region, couldn't happen. They stayed with that battle for 17 years, and in the process won a court decision that is called the Scenic Hudson decision. And a great deal of environmental legislation at the federal level, including the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, can be traced back to the Scenic Hudson decision. About 6 or 7 years ago, we launched a new campaign that we call Saving the Land That Matters Most. So we're working very hard with farm families and trying to preserve some of the most significant farms in the area. So far we've preserved 75 of them, amounting to more than 11,000 acres. And our goal is to create a sustainable food supply to the Hudson Valley, but also to help with New York City's food supply.
In 1969, Pete Seeger and friends launched a Hudson River sloop that would be a 106-foot reminder of the need for clear water. That July in 2013, there was great sadness as Toshi, Pete's wife of 6 decades, moved on.
Scenic Hudson is not anti-business or jobs at all. I talked a little bit about our work actually spurs the economy. But there's a consideration that companies need to step up and meet, and that is if you're a company, especially of the size and stature of a group like General Electric or LG Electronics, you have a responsibility to do more than just make money. You should give something back to the communities where you do business. Down on the Palisades, actually in a portion of New Jersey, Englewood Cliffs, but it heavily affects views that people on the New York side of the Hudson River have. LG Electronics Corporation has proposed a very large, tall 147-foot corporate headquarters on the Palisades. We don't think that's a good idea. The Palisades are a recognized national natural landmark, and what Scenic Hudson, working along with Riverkeeper and a number of other environmental groups, have advocated for the company to do is say, by all means, build your headquarters, create the jobs you're talking about, lower the height of the building, and build it to its same size, but lower and wider. In that way, you accomplish your goals, but you don't have to intrude on something that's regarded really as a national treasure.
Scenic Hudson helped fund Walkway Over the Hudson at Poughkeepsie, where you can walk, run, skate, bike, or push a stroller, and where once there were freight trains.
Up in Columbia County, his Persian-style home, which is a real national treasure, is called Olana. This area and Frederick Church and Olana are vital to the history and the story of America. Scenic Hudson has spent $6 million over about 20 years to protect 1,000 acres so that when you're up on that wonderful site and you're enjoying the views that inspired one of America's greatest artists, you really get that same kind of feeling of what that place was like and what inspired him. It's very important that Olana attracts 130,000 people a year to visit that site, and Columbia County employs about 8,000 people based on tourism industry, so there is an important economic consideration as well.
30 miles upstream from New York City is Rockland Lake, New York, where steamers stopped and tugboats picked up barges of crushed stone and much prized Rockland Lake ice. This small railroad transported the ice from the lake to the ice houses. A gravity railroad took products over the hill to the Hudson. The ice was pure and good tasting, and New York City restaurants and hotels wanted it. But times change.
We're at a location on Hudson River at Haverstraw Bay where United Water is proposing to build a desalination plant for Rockland County's drinking water.
United Water Company serves both the New York side and the New Jersey side with water. It's the same company. There's a United Water in New York and United Water in New Jersey. And it's owned by the same company, Suez Environment, which is an international company.
One of the things that we're concerned about is that this location is about 3.5 miles south of the Indian Point nuclear power plant, and we know that that plant leaks strontium-90 and tritium into the river.
So they said, okay, right now we know that we're not sure if we need the water, but the Public Service Commission says we need the water. And United Water came back and said, instead of a reservoir, what we want to do is we want to build a desalination plant in the Hudson River.
Rockland County has the second highest breast cancer rate in New York State, as it is. And people are concerned about drinking water that comes from the river.
Well, I went to a meeting because I saw a notice in the newspaper about this proposal to build a desalination plant that United Water wanted to do. It was at the Suffern Library. And the purpose of the meeting was not about whether we needed a desalination plant. It was to explain to people why it was going to be such a good idea. The overall interest from United Water is to send more water down to New Jersey, have us build a desalination plant, drink Hudson water, have to pay for that, increased cost for building that plant, so that we can drink more Hudson River water here, so they can send more of our fresh water from Lake DeForest down to New Jersey. People would use less water to the point where the desalination plant wouldn't even be needed. Government has a certain way of reviewing these kinds of projects. The Public Service Commission has it. It hands it over to the DEC. The Department of Health looks at it. Nobody looks at it together. They're all looking at parts of it, you know, and we can say that about a lot of things about government. It was the idea of a sustainable plan would require the government to look at things in a more holistic way. So we used to think the Public Service Commission makes these decisions or the DEC makes these decisions, but we know the governor has his influence on these agencies that are appointed by him. They never have ever seen anything like this before. They've never had a public hearing on something where they already made a decision and went back to review it again. They've never done that before. Once the PSC makes a decision, that's it.
just by its resistance in the mud, in the sediment. Any possible harm to the river is taking place underwater. The violence of the pile driving, the hammers hitting the piles. Underwater, sound travels like a shockwave. To mitigate that, the thruway is required, again in their permits, to put what's called a bubble curtain around the piles that are being driven. It's a column, a cylinder of bubbles from the bottom to the surface.
Every day there's a new threat. Right now we're looking at the Coast Guard's proposal to transport frack waste across America's rivers, the Hudson included. We don't even know what's in fracking waste and what would happen if a spill were to occur on the Hudsons.
The fact that he's rooting for ecological irresponsibility. He's here to taunt the crowd.
2005, when Dick Cheney was our vice president, he had it exempted from the new energy laws. And Dick Cheney was also the CEO of Halliburton. Halliburton was responsible for developing the technology of fracking. So as of now, companies aren't required to report what chemicals they're using, and they actually can put all kinds of non-disclosure agreements on doctors. They won't tell doctors why people are getting sick until they sign a non-disclosure agreement. So doctors can't treat people and workers who are getting sick from these chemicals until they sign a non-disclosure agreement.
This outpouring of energy had some effect. In December of 2014, the Cuomo administration's EPA banned fracking in New York State. By January 2014, the 94-year-old folk singer was in the hospital. January 27th, Pete would leave us. The work that Pete and Toshi had started was now left for other people to finish. Up in Saratoga County, where the river narrows, this little beach hasn't been used for swimming in years. Nobody jumps from the tree to the water anymore. It's a place for PCB dredging. Monsanto used to make PCBs. Down in Manhattan, though, they couldn't wait to get into the Hudson. On May 24th, the water was only 60 degrees, so most put on wetsuits for the season's first Hudson River swim.
Core of our work with the boat is a patrol, looking for polluters, trying to deter polluters. The question the public asks the most is, how's the water? And by that, they're not asking what's the dissolved oxygen, they're not asking what's the pH, they're not asking stuff like that. They're asking, if I swim in the Hudson, am I going to get sick? Yeah, so there are many contaminants you can sample for in the Hudson, from PCBs to radionuclides to organics to chemicals to pharmaceuticals. We picked fecal contamination because that's what the public was really interested in. And that was the way to engage the largest part of the public. We started down at Peekskill, New York City at first, and then we grew it all the way up to the Mohawk River, where Mohawk River meets the Hudson at Waterford. And we post the data online, May through October. And last year, the last couple years, we've expanded it now. So that's 155 miles. We've expanded it now into the tributaries. So up and down the valley, this data is driving change. We didn't know when we started whether the public would turn their back on a polluted waterway, or whether the public would engage and try to help. They say the water's dirty, I'm going to try to fix it. So it's been very successful.
Had to do self-rescue classes right here in the water. So I went into the Hudson, that day. I think in the succeeding years, the water quality has probably got better. Some people remember it in the really dirty days, I guess back in the 70s. I wasn't in New York then. But I've never heard of anybody, getting sick from the water.
I'm Caitlin Peterson. I'm the president of the Manhattan Community Boathouse. We are a free public kayaking organization, so we're all volunteers, and our goal is to put the public out on the Hudson River and 7 days a week, doing free kayaking on the Hudson River. You know, we get a lot of questions about the safety of the water. You know, what their friends tell them about the river turning them green is, first of all, not true. I'm in it almost every day, all summer long, and I'm okay. And so that's what we tell them. We tell them that it's a great place to be. It's a great place to be out on the water, to be active on the water. And it's a lot cleaner than they ever imagined it would be. And once people get out there, they come back and they realize it's not that bad. It's not that bad at all.
But you have to constantly be vigilant on the Hudson. You know, it's out of sight, out of mind. It's very easy to dump in the river. Constant vigilance and to keep the river clean, and maybe one day there'll be commercial fishermen again.
We're concerned about the waste building up at Indian Point, as well as New York's 4 other nuclear reactors, which are all on the shore of Lake Ontario.
People are concerned about drinking water that comes from the river.
I don't recommend drinking it.
We're also fighting barges carrying crude oil shipments on the Hudson, and we don't even know how to respond right now to those kinds of spills should one occur. So every day it's an ongoing affront, and we need everyone. We need everyone's help and support, and to maintain this beautiful natural resource so that it's something beautiful that we all have for many years to come, forever.